So my main point, since we don't have a lot of time, was actually the Islamic views around climate change and just our methods. So I think when you think of Islam, one of the first things that comes to mind is conservative. Islam is very traditional. It's a staple that we will be old-fashioned. Obviously, back in the time of the Prophet, where we get most of our customs from, we didn't have demonstrations and protests. So obviously, being involved in this kind of stuff is very new. But obviously, there was a big debate a few years ago about whether voting is halal, and there were lots of controversial views, but the most widely accepted one now is that we should always vote in favour of Islam. And obviously that falls into the politics part of Islam. And when you think of demonstrations and strikes, you think of disruption. But one of Climate Strike Leicester's main thing is that we are very peaceful, we don't disrupt anything, and all in all, we are just exercising our rights as citizens to protest and to have a voice. We're lucky to be living in England, where we do have a democracy, where we can protest without fear of repercussions, and we fully intend to exercise that. So if you think of progression of Muslims, I have a teacher, an RE teacher, who's very learned. She has a PhD in Islamic studies, and one of the things that she's very passionate and vocal about is that she thinks that Muslims are not progressive enough. In GCSE RE, it's actually compulsory to study Christianity. And when you look at the outreach that they do for the community, such as street pastors and food banks, you really think, wow, when you look at Islam, they really don't have as much community outreach. So, and if you also look at influential Muslim figures in politics and stuff, you don't see a Muslim Greta Thunberg, you don't see even Ilhan Omar in America. She very recently became congresswoman. Now, today, there is more of a platform for Muslims to step forward, for anyone to step forward, especially the youth, and we are doing that. We are exercising our freedom, and we are ensuring that our voices are heard through these kind of movements. So truly, Climate Strike Leicester and all the climate strikes, we are under an umbrella. Our main message, I think, would be not just we want the government to do something about climate change, but we want to be heard because it's about time. So one of the main things I wanted to talk about was the view that everything that happens is considered to be God's plan. And for some Muslims, climate change is God's will and it shouldn't be questioned. However, the Quran often states that we should protect the environment, and it would be one thing if climate change was not caused by man, but it actually is. If you look at most of the causes, it's our use of fossil fuels, our use of our carbon emissions, and I think we have a very big role in this, and thus we should be trying to clean it up. And if we can't do that, we should try to force the government. It's only what's right, and we are doing it in the best way that we know how.
Thank you very much, Aasiya. And who joined us? Let's give a round. 16, is that right? 15 years old. So I'm just incredibly inspired by you being. I would never have been able to sit here and be as coherent as you have been. So thank you so much for that. Is it going to be Imran next?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So,
Bismillah, Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon everyone. I'm Imran, I'm in college and I'm doing my A-levels currently. I'm also part of the organising team for Climate Strike Leicester, and I got involved last February, just over a year ago, when it was all kicking off in the UK. So I'm going to give 4 main reasons why I think British Muslims should be much more involved in climate activism and environmentalist activism more broadly, quite apart from the first and fundamental reason that Islam mandates we treat the natural world with respect. Our Prophet ﷺ gave us strict rules for how to deal with trees, water and animals. The Quran says that all species and nations like yourselves, that is to say they have rights. So what a religious viewpoint can contribute to the secular discourse around the environment is the idea that we shouldn't simply see the natural world as a kind of tool. It has its own inherent value, which is something that capitalism will never fully recognise. Secondly, there's the economic case. Islam has a lot to offer here. Islam strictly prohibits interest. It's considered a form of oppression. The economist Ann Pettifor argues that Islam's opposition to interest is incredibly important today because interest lies at the heart of a lot of the problems we face. The economy impacts the ecosystem, so a high interest rate demands ever-rising extraction of the Earth's assets. High interest rates mean that too many fish are taken from the sea, more and more trees are cut down, we pollute the atmosphere more and more, and we farm land relentlessly, weakening its structure. And a lot of this extraction happens because of the need to repay constantly rising debts. So it's no surprise that we're beginning to hit the ecosystem's limits because we have an economic paradigm that isn't bound by any ethical values, and here Islam has much to offer. Thirdly, when religious groups speak of environmental concerns, the conversation is too often focused solely on encouraging individuals to lower their own carbon footprints. Now, this is absolutely important, but the problem we have is that only 100 corporations are responsible for over 70% of global carbon emissions. What's necessary then is to fulfill the ethical imperative to speak truth to power. The greatest jihad, we are told, is a word of truth spoken before an unjust ruler. If we want to avert the worst of global heating, we have to rapidly transform our economy away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy. Solar and wind energy are now cheaper than oil, coal and natural gas, and yet our government still has a stated target of reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050, although we're not on track to reach it until the end of the century. The fact is we have a government that is beholden to the interests of the fossil fuel industry through corporate lobbying. We know now that Exxon, one of the largest oil corporations in the world, hired scientists in the 1980s who accurately predicted the global heating that their actions would cause. They then spent the next 30 years pouring billions and billions of dollars into funding climate denial, trying to muddy the water and make the science unclear, simply because they wanted to maximize their profits. If we want to avert catastrophe, the simple truth is we have to take on the fossil fuel industry. We have to tell them that they can't continue to put their short-term profit over the future of the planet. And that's the ultimate goal of our climate strikes. We have to become a lobbying force that can overcome the lobbying of the fossil fuel industry. They have all the money, but we can build up a people-powered movement. The head of OPEC, the world's largest oil cartel, said a few months ago that climate activists are the biggest threat to the oil industry, and I was very happy to hear that. Religious people have a moral duty to be at the forefront of this deeply moral cause, and I think that speaks to what Aasiya was saying about the ethics of protest. Fourth, the demand for climate justice that young people are shouting from the streets is connected with practically every issue we face. The strike movement nationally supports the idea of the Green New Deal, which says that the government should manage and accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels in a way that's just and equitable and actually helps create a fairer economy. A big weakness of environmental movements historically has been that they're seen as something you're interested in if you have no other problems. So the Green movement has been overwhelmingly white and middle class. By tying environmental concerns to economic justice, the Green New Deal can change this. And actually, if you have economic security, you're far more likely to have time to think about your carbon footprint. That's why we require system change. People ask why British Muslims aren't en masse engaged with environmental issues. Well, many British Muslims have less They're less economically well off than the national average, and you don't think about the end of the world if you're busy thinking about the end of the month or how to pay your bills. So the demand for climate justice is deeply important for Muslims to get behind. And very quickly with the last reason, climate change should be particularly worrying for Muslims because the Middle East, Africa and Asia will be the most hard hit by climate catastrophe, and these places are where most of the world's Muslims are. It's a cruel irony that despite having benefited the least from the Industrial Revolution, the Muslim world will be the first victims of its consequence, the climate crisis. As Muslims in Britain, the country where the Industrial Revolution and fossil fuel capitalism started, we have a moral duty to help Britain to lead the way in solving this problem. The UN has warned that what we could see is climate apartheid, where the rich build figurative bunkers and just protect themselves, leaving the poor to languish and suffer. And we can only imagine how extreme this will be in the kingdoms and dictatorships of the Muslim world. Muslim minorities in the West should be worried as well. Far-right national populists are on the march, and soon they won't be denying climate change, they'll be turning to eco-nationalism and far-right environmentalism. This has already started. Nearly a year ago, there was a mass shooting by a white supremacist at a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. In his manifesto, he described himself, among other things, as an eco-fascist and cited environmental reasons for opposing immigrants and non-white people. Marine Le Pen in France has also started using environmental rhetoric, and fascinatingly, just a few weeks ago in Austria, the Green Party formed a coalition with the far right, where they agreed to carbon taxes, hijab bans and tighter borders. So if eco-nationalism prevails over what we might call the climate justice movement, this could be fatal for the inevitable waves of climate refugees, and it will also be bad news for minorities here. Muslims must be involved in influencing the direction of the environmental movement if we're to avoid this. So, to conclude, all this is to say that there are many reasons why Muslims should be especially concerned about the climate crisis, and that we as British Muslims have a moral duty to help lead the way in campaigning for positive change. And the Sacred Alliance with other religious groups has much to offer the climate movement generally, and we should remember that the climate crisis will be absolutely central to global politics in years to come. Thank you.
Expecting you to take that particular end, but thank you for that. Erica.
Hi, I'm Erica. I'm 16 years old. I'm the head steward for Climate Strike Leicester, and I've been doing that since April last year. I've been striking for almost a year now, and I'm a Christian, so I'm going to give a slightly different perspective on it. I hope that you'll find it interesting. But I'm really grateful that we've been invited to speak about this today, and I wanted to talk specifically about my experiences of the strikes and the importance of climate activism for me as a Christian, and particularly 4 sort of key points in terms of the role of strikers and religious communities in activism that we need to consider when changing the conversation when it comes to climate change. So I became involved because of people talking to me about it. My friends messaged me and suggested that I get involved. Didn't quite know that I was signing up for over a year of activism and things like this. But clearly this means that discussion is really central to getting as many people involved in the movement as possible. And what's fantastic is that there are more conversations happening about climate change within religious communities like today. But ultimately it also has to be an ingrained cultural shift in attitudes, especially in organised religion, in Islam and Christianity and all the other religions, for instance within the church. When I was particularly looking into the main reasons why I thought as a Christian I should be concerned about the climate crisis, I found 2 main reasons which both Aasiya and Imran have touched on. One is that creation is a gift and it should be cared for. It's privileged, but we're currently abusing it and exploiting what we have. As religious believers, we have a duty to protect it. But secondly, responding to injustice, prioritising the vulnerable frontline communities, who are the 50% of the population faced with the effects of climate change right now, even though they've only contributed to 10% of global emissions. And as a Christian particularly, when questioning how to go about tackling the climate crisis, I've been looking to the example of Jesus. who, as I'm sure you're aware, is a central figure within Christianity. He particularly stood up for the poor and marginalised, and I think that's a key aspect that we need to consider when tackling the climate emergency. It's important to communicate a message of care within religious communities, and to follow his, like Jesus' example, but also the examples of other prophets within different religions. We shouldn't be afraid to challenge those in positions of influence and leadership either. So Jesus, you may have heard of a story of him turning over tables in the temple because he was fed up of the temple being used as a marketplace and a place for profit. So clearly he was a pretty big fan of radical change, and he wasn't scared of the idea of civil disobedience, so I thought, why should we be? The second thing that religious communities need to consider is empowering young people. With the strikes and my activism that I've been so fortunate to be involved with, I've felt really empowered in being able to speak out about what I believe about this issue. Through speeches, just chanting with a megaphone at strike days, and opportunities to open dialogue with different organisations, such as my church and my school. So with my school, it started with me sending letters justifying why I should be given permission to strike. But then a group of us since then have formed as our school's Earth Society and have actually shifted our head teachers' attitudes towards truly understanding the urgency of the situation. And it means that actually as religious communities we have a responsibility to give young people the platform to speak out like this today and contribute to this and see what they have to offer. The third one is building more interfaith relationships to promote unity and solidarity, because ultimately the climate crisis doesn't care what religion you are, what race you are, what gender you are, your sexual orientation. I've always loved how the strikes have seemed to break down these barriers between young people who are all passionate about the same core issue. But still, the movement has a distinct lack of diversity within, and even in Leicester, which is a very multicultural area and it's a majority-minority area, strikers are still mainly white middle class. And actually, this isn't just a white middle class or a Christian or a Muslim issue. We need to ask ourselves why this is still the case and actively work against it, because the climate crisis is an intergenerational, an intersectional and an interfaith issue that we need to be considering. And it doesn't just affect religious communities, of course, but is a threat to entire ecosystems and humanity. The final thing I wanted to talk about was actually something that Bravia introduced in her opening speech. The three things: faith, I think what you said, solidarity, faith, hope and faith, and compassion. So the three that I want to talk about, there's a verse in the Bible that says, and now these three remain: faith, hope and love. So obviously, as religious communities, we need to engage with our faith and see what our faith says about these issues, whatever faith that may be. Secondly, we need to be considering how we communicate the message of love. And actually, we need to take into consideration our emotional reaction to the climate crisis. We need to give a space for lament and grief about what we have done, acknowledge how bad the situation is, and feel compassion for those who are at the forefront of the effects, but also turn this around. Repentance means turning things around and changing direction, recognising we've got it wrong, and we need to actually change course and be part of that as religious communities. A really significant moment for me recently has been the General Synod, the Church of England General Synod, which is a national council of representatives from counties all over England, met to debate on the climate crisis, and the Church of England have committed to net zero carbon emissions by 2030 because of pressure being put on them to have a change. And that's given me a lot of hope that actually I can engage with Leicester representatives and we can, as young people, but also as religious communities, have an impact on this problem. And finally, we need to be the hope for the future, for positive change and drastic action, and the striking community embodies this, and I've loved to see that over the past year, and we need more of that. So more hope, more faith, more love, more solidarity. Thank you.